One of the questions I often get asked is why can't new cars look like old cars? We all kind of have a great nostalgia and fondness for the styling associated with vintage automobiles, and there's just something lacking, let's face it, in new cars. Well, I thought I would we won't call it a porch chat because I'm not on camera here on the porch, but we'll call it, I guess, a fireside chat. Go to your nearest fireplace, turn it on, or light it up. And if you don't have a fireplace, then put on a graphic of a fire from YouTube or someplace else. And let's talk about why classic vehicles, at least in our minds, look so much better than new vehicles. Now, this again is obviously a subjective decision, and there are plenty of new vehicles that I think are candidly attractive. But there are a few reasons behind why the modern vehicles don't quite look the same as the classic vehicles. The first reason is that there are way more constraints on designers today than there were in the past. A lot of these are related to federal regulations in the US, or maybe not even the US, it could be worldwide. And because companies are trying to adhere to standards worldwide in developing a product, they basically have to ensure the designs meet all of those, irrespective of the country in which it originates, so long as it's a large country of sale that has the potential for significant volumes, like the US or China or the European Union. To explain this, let's take a look at this 1966 Tornado, kind of unquestionably one of the best-looking American cars of the time. And the first thing that you notice is these thin bladed fenders up front and a pretty, well, let's call it styled bumper, but not one that's overly functional. Clearly, if you crashed into something, what's going to hit first? The tips of the bumpers out at the fender tips. Now, today you couldn't do styling like this because those blades, they look like blades even, are so sharp that would not pass pedestrian impact standards. In other words, cars today have to be engineered such that if they hit a pedestrian at a certain speed, the pedestrian's roll over the vehicle is actually controlled. And that dictates the hood as well as the grille and the height of the hood and the grille. And so it makes it pretty challenging overall to have a hood that would look like this. You just couldn't do it today. So many vehicles have relatively high hoods, in part because of that issue, and also because a lot of the newer engines are turbocharged and intercooled, and there's a lot more cooling that's required than on these old vehicles in some cases, despite the fact that the engine sizes on the old cars are larger. So you'd think that the cooling requirements would be less on new cars. Well, it really depends on how much strain the engine is under. If it's a smaller engine under a lot of strain and a lot of turbocharging, it needs quite a bit of cooling. So you need that airflow, you need a big grille, and you consequently can't have something like you see on this 66 Tornado where there's not a lot of open surface area for the cooling to flow through. So that's another challenge. Yet another challenge can be seen here if you take a look at the A-pillars on the vehicle and the lack of a B-pillar. These are toothpick A-pillars on this Tornado, and you see no B-pillar, and that would just be taboo today because of the rollover standards that exist on vehicles. Consequently, all cars really have these thick, chunky A, B, C pillars and very thick roofs. So beyond the pillars being thin on this vehicle, take a look at that roof panel and how thin it is. And it provides just a beautiful light element to the design that really just can't be executed on modern vehicles without special and expensive techniques because it wouldn't meet the rollover standards. This is why when you get in a modern vehicle, you need all these things like blind spot monitoring, etc., because you just can't see out of the car because in large part of the rollover safety standards that dictate fat, chunky pillars that obstruct your view. We also see on this Tornado that one of its great features are those oversized fender flares. And this would generally not be executed on a vehicle today for the principal reason of just cost. This would take probably 5 or 6 strikes on the die to make that fender, to get it that crease. This is a one-piece fender. It's not two-pieced and seamed down the middle. So that might even take 6 or 7 strikes, honestly, to get it that creased, plus get the fender bulge in it. And consequently today, most of the time, automakers don't like to have more than 3 strikes on the stamping dies and the presses before the sheet metal is in finished form. So you can't get these really deep draws and forms and super creased panels because it takes so many more strikes on a stamping press to produce that metal. The more strikes, the more cost, because of the more time it takes, as well as the more dies you have to execute that sheet metal. So that, again, is just taboo today. Another issue that today's vehicles have to contend with really is aerodynamics. And this is a chief concern amongst designers today. And it really was not a concern back in the 60s and early 70s, because who cared about fuel mileage when gas prices were in the cents per gallon as opposed to dollars per gallon. Take a look, for example, at the front end of this 72 Continental that I have here. Imagine the wind coming up on this 72 Continental at 70 plus miles per hour, or how people drive today, 90 miles an hour. That is not an aerodynamic front end by any stretch of the imagination. You're basically going to be plowing the air, and you're losing maybe 1-2 miles per gallon fuel economy, maybe even more at 70 miles per hour because of that front end. And since the fenders stick out proud of the headlight area, you're also trapping the wind in that area, creating even more resistance. So this front end would just not fly. And this is why you see a lot of modern cars have front ends that have tapering off to the sides to really help direct the airflow around the vehicle so that it doesn't get stuck in pockets like what you see here. Aerodynamics is also the reason why you don't see rear ends like this in the Tornado anymore. This fastback design appears to be aerodynamic, but let me tell you, it's actually not. The best aerodynamic shapes actually have that tall butt in the rear because the airflow goes up over the roof and sticks on the car until the end of the vehicle, and then it kind of swirls as it goes off the car and back into the regular distribution of air behind the vehicle. But when you have a fastback profile like this, the air is actually creating little eddies all the way down that roof line because it's coming detached from the vehicle body. And so what appears to be an aerodynamic shape actually is not. In fact, one of the vehicles that GM did, a concept car that I think is one of the most beautiful concept cars ever made, the Aerovet in the 1970s, it appears to be highly aerodynamic. It actually is not for that reason. That tapering off of the back end is not aerodynamic. What you really want is a car that's more wedge-shaped, starts low and rises, and that is optimal for airflow management. And that's why so many cars today have that so-called wedge shape to them, which frankly I think is a tired aesthetic, but it's one that's almost necessary to manage aero. And as we transition to the 72 Monte Carlo, we see another issue with these vehicles, and that is big chrome bumpers. Now, the bumpers got even bigger after 1973 and 74 because of impact standards, but notice the big chrome bumper. Well, these are expensive because chrome plating has become a very challenging process to do in an environmentally friendly way, so it costs a lot more than it did back then. And, of course, these big bumpers weigh a lot, and one of the things that designers are trying to do is achieve weight savings so that the vehicles get better fuel economy. More weight, less fuel economy. So the bumpers basically have devolved into fascias, which really were introduced, I would say, on the American cars in the early 70s and late 60s Pontiacs even, like the 1968 GTO with that Endura front bumper that is kind of like a modern fascia almost. But those fascias save weight over these bumpers, and that's a principal consideration when designing a vehicle. How are you saving weight and what kind of materials are you using? So big, heavy, chrome-plated bumpers, they're just out. Moreover, when you see this Monte Carlo, you notice that it's relatively low to the ground. These classic vehicles were pretty low, and that was by design. They were designed to be lower, longer, and wider. That was the styling theme of the time. Well, today, everybody likes to sit up high, and you've got to have your truck that's like 7 feet tall, or the SUV where the seating position is rather high. And so if you want a tall vehicle, that means that the body sides have to be tall and you're stuck with a hatch almost in the rear. Although they used to have separable glass from the hatch. I think that went out of favor because of cost reasons. You can imagine having a hinged piece of glass coupled with an overall tailgate or a hinged door at the back was just too expensive. So every SUV seems to have some sort of a one-piece hatchback there. But in general, if people want to sit tall, it's also pretty constricting because it's hard to make very tall figures look athletic and lithe, and it's just not a great aesthetic. And so consequently, you have a lot of designers who are trying to do things with SUVs and tall SUVs, often by putting a lot of body side surfacing on them and making the cars look like crumpled pieces of origami to give it some visual interest because you have these long pieces of sheet metal. I don't think it's necessarily all that effective, but that's what the consumer wants today. In other words, they want to sit up high. And that's something that when you drive one of these cars, even the cars from the 80s, you notice that they're relatively low. That was a designer's best friend. Designers always want lower, longer, wider, not shorter, taller, narrower. That's really tough to design, but that's really what customers want in many cases today. One thing that is, from a design standpoint, better about modern vehicles are the wheels. The wheels now, whereas they used to be 14, 15 inches, might be 17, 18, 20, 22 inches. And this generally helps the vehicles look better, particularly if they're taller. You need to have wheels that are proportioned to the overall body. The problem is that when you have larger wheels, you often have lower profile tires. As a consequence, the ride degrades. And so one of the things that we love about the vintage vehicles is that boulevard ride. And it's really hard to capture that boulevard ride when you have very thin sidewalls on the tires. But again, people want these big wheels, and you almost need them on modern cars in order for the car to look right. If you take a look at this 1982 Trans Am, for instance, this car has 15-inch wheels. And by the way, standard on the Firebirds was 14-inch wheels. And if you look at the wheel, it doesn't look like it's all that small. And that's because the vehicle has a low overall height. And the relationship of the wheel and the tire to the body, particularly right above the wheel, looks fine. There's not much body above that wheel and tire. But on modern cars, there's a ton of body there. And so you need bigger wheels and tires to make that look correct. And as a consequence, you're degrading the ride. So this is just a sampling of factors as to why modern vehicles maybe don't look as good to our eyes as the classics. But some of this is dictated by regulations, and I won't get into whether or not that's good or bad. I think in general, I would prefer to be in a car accident in a modern car than a classic, particularly one from, let's say, before the mid-1970s. The cars were really started to be engineered for crash around the early 1970s. Before that, they really weren't. So I don't know that I'd want to be in an accident with a vehicle before, let's say, 1967 and the collapsible steering wheels, as an example, or even overhead seat belts. But there are some trade-offs, and one of the trade-offs is the looks in some cases, shall we say. Hope that was interesting for you. If you enjoyed it, let me know, and be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.